Canadian. Okay. I speak Canadian. Like, I don't speak Canadian, but I can understand it. Because I grew up in Michigan. That's took advantage of existing law by giving a big game.
Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing tonight? Okay.
Close to the mouth.
Close to your mouth. Very good.
Okay. Tonight we're going to be hosting Jayton Gill. He's going to be doing a presentation on Bitcoin. A few things to cover first. Final maps have not come out yet, but we're making great strides and great progress. And also, Salvation Army Soup Kitchen, 23rd of February. See me if you're interested in signing up for it. Either see me in person, send me an email, or ping me on Facebook or text me.
What day of the week is that?
That is a Friday. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jayton Gill.
So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jayton Gill. I've been involved in Bitcoin for the past few years, and thanks for having me. This is one of my favorite groups to present to about Bitcoin, just because libertarians already tend to have the mindset where they're capable of really seeing the potential of where Bitcoin could go. And that's what really excited me years ago when I found out about it, and I'd love to share that with people. So let's go to the first slide. So I'd like to start with exploring some of the history that led up to Bitcoin's invention. Those of you who are familiar with Hayek, back in the 70s, he espoused this radical idea that we should denationalize currencies and have private currencies competing against one another. And beyond that, Friedman predicted in 1999 that at some point there would become internet money, where we could all transact with one another without knowing where the money was coming from, or going to. And I cut out some of the quote, but he ends out with being able to avoid taxes on it as well.
Yay!
And there were a lot of ideas that started to explore this concept in the 1990s. There was Eagle, DigiCash, Beans, Liberty Reserve. Most of these failed, all for the same reason, because they were all centralized services. And some of them became homes for criminals and fraudsters, and then they were shut down by the government. Some of them never really caught on because they didn't have the promise that they thought they did, and failed the dot-com bust. That's what Beans did. So this was all kind of the environment that was leading up to the technology progressing to the point where we got it about a decade ago. Next slide, please. After the failure of centralized currencies like Eagle, Liberty Reserve, not Liberty Reserve, but later. But around the same time that these things were going on, some anonymous individual or group of individuals, known as Satoshi Nakamoto, published a white paper on a cyberpunks list that envisioned a decentralized currency that people could use to interact without trusting anybody else in the network. This was revolutionary at the time, but nobody noticed it much at the time, and it took a few years to catch on. And I want to point out that the anti-authoritarian nature of Bitcoin was evident from the very start, because Satoshi, whoever he was, chose specifically to embed in the very first Bitcoin block the heading from the Times on January 3rd, 2009, which says Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for the banks. And that's something that gets lost a lot now. Bitcoin's so popular that people don't know about its origins or ignore them. Bitcoin was always well mated with libertarianism from the very start. So the real driving selling point behind Bitcoin is that there is no central authority in control of it. There's no issuing bank, no government controlling it. It is a fully decentralized currency. There are lots of developers that are working on it. We all band together to determine what features are going to go into Bitcoin, what problems we want to tackle. There's no centralized top-down control like there is with every other system of money that has ever existed that we could actually trust to use. as I said, there's an open development effort that is all open source. So anybody who's knowledgeable can go in and not only look at it, but also contribute to it. One of the most interesting things is that for anyone who's skeptical of the Fed and inflation, the inflation curve for monetary supply for Bitcoin is fixed. It always has been from the very beginning. We know exactly how many Bitcoins there are going to be over time and exactly what rate they'll be created. Bitcoins can be transmitted literally anywhere in the globe within minutes. You don't need an intermediary. As long as you have your recipient's address, you can send it there, it'll show up. You don't have to worry about all the friction that you run into when you try to do traditional bank transfers. And beyond that, they are irreversible transfers. Once they're confirmed, nobody can grab that money back. And that has pluses and minuses to it, but it's something to be aware of. Next slide, please. So this right here is a map of the entire Bitcoin network, and I should qualify that. It's not quite the entire network, but it's all the network nodes that can be discovered. There are a lot of other nodes that are running that are not accepting new peers. So this number is actually a little bit low compared to what it actually is. But you'll notice we have a high concentration of Bitcoin nodes all throughout the United States and Europe, and a little bit more in East Asia. But the neat thing is they're literally in every continent on the globe, say in Antarctica. But it's grown to the point now where it's so robust that a large number of these nodes can be shut down, where a country could take some very authoritarian measures against Bitcoin, but on a broad scale would not affect Bitcoin on a global level. This thing is going to persist no matter what happens at the state level, I think. People are just getting to the point where they realize that. Next slide, please. So the core of what's behind Bitcoin is called a blockchain, and some of you might have heard of this. What it is, it's basically a new type of data structure within computer science. It's a way of storing data in a decentralized fashion where you don't rely on a central server in any one place. What happens is it's managed on a peer-to-peer network. And this was certainly inspired in part by the advent of BitTorrent that came out in the early 2000s. It showed that this sort of thing was possible in order to share data directly between peers over the internet without relying on intermediaries in between. So the same thing happens in Bitcoin. And it's trustless because all the network nodes share every bit of information that's on the blockchain. Not only do they share it, but they can verify it. So you're not receiving information from your peers that you have to trust that they are sending you directly, because every node, by default, checks every transaction to make sure that it's valid, and then they all come to consensus on the order of transactions, which transactions are valid, and of course rejecting the ones that are not. The fascinating thing about this is that it enables timestamp ordered storage of records that is secured by cryptography, cannot be reversed, and prior to Bitcoin, this was just not possible without using some sort of centralized service, relying on a server somewhere to determine what was valid and what was not, and issue a decree saying, here's where the coins are, here's where the value are, and here's the data that we're going to accept. It's also highly resistant to malleability. If you want to go in and try to change something, you're not going to be able to do it. All the other nodes are going to reject your attempt at changing data or accepting an invalid transaction. It's highly resistant to any sort of attack. And the larger it grows, the more resistant it is. And after being active for almost 9 years now, actually a little over 9 years, the network is to the point where it can resist even attacks from leading nation states. It's just incredible the amount that it's grown in the past decade. So blockchains can be used for all sorts of data storage, but of course Bitcoin, which was the first, is used to store a ledger of financial transactions. So what the Bitcoin blockchain is used for is recording who has what money and where. And all it is people sending transactions back and forth to each other. And every one is stored on the blockchain where every node keeps track of each one. And that's how they all come to view. Next slide, please. So hopefully, at this point, at least piquing your interest as a key of cryptocurrency. And the reason why Bitcoin is so revolutionary is because it's the first solution to the double spending problem. Like I said, without relying on a central authority. In the physical universe, if I give you some cash or bar of gold, there's no double spend problem because I can't spend the same physical amount of money twice. But this has been a problem, of course, in digital transactions because there was no way prior to Bitcoin to ensure that the same collection of bits indicating value were not spent to person A and to person B. This would be a fraudulent transaction. Another thing fantastic about Bitcoin is it requires no permission to use. I've encountered no shortage of people asking online if they could use Bitcoin because they're under 18 or in such and such country. Nobody cares. If you're alive and you have access to the internet, you can use Bitcoin. It's also highly robust against any sort of censorship or government attacks. These things tend to not affect Bitcoin just due to its very nature. Like I said, it's a global, frictionless ledger of transactions that is highly resistant to any sort of attack, even from large nation states. And of course, on a practical level, in comparison to fiat currencies or even gold medals, anybody remember there's a product that came out a few years ago, it was a gram of gold was split up into tiny little pieces that were like a 50th, I believe, in the attempt to make gold more spendable. But even a 50th of a gram of gold is still almost $1, and it's so tiny you might lose it. Bitcoin is far more divisible than that. Even if it hits $1 million, the largest denominator, the smallest denominator in Bitcoin will still be cent. And global transactions remain relatively fast and cheap. I found this out myself when I was ordering products from China to send an international wire. It usually takes 1 to 3 business days and costs you about $50 depending on your bank. But if you use Bitcoin to do the same thing, which I also did, you can send the same transaction for just a few dollars and it'll be confirmed within a few minutes. Next slide, please. So for anyone who's heard a little bit more about Bitcoin, you might have heard the term mining, which of course is just a reference to gold mining. It's sort of a misnomer. It's just the process by which Bitcoin is coming into existence. What miners are really doing is transaction processing. And they do so by using specialized computers which are running 24/7. They handle all the transactions coming in on the Bitcoin network, and they perform mathematical work to group them together in what's called a block. And blocks are ordered linearly in a very simple structure. That's what ends up being a blockchain. It's a chain of blocks. Each block contains a grouping of transactions. What's very interesting is that there's an algorithm that determines how quickly blocks can be produced. No matter how many miners come into the system, it's automatically adjusted so the blocks are always produced every 10 minutes on average. And therefore, we're not flooded with new blocks and thus new Bitcoins. Because every block is creating new Bitcoins as well. So rewarded to the miners for their processing efforts, as well as the fees for the transactions that they process that go into the blocks. Next slide, please. So this is a graph of the supply of Bitcoin. As I mentioned before, this was known from day one. And the red line here, you can see, goes up and has a scale on the left side. Viewers in the back may have probably seen that. But that's the total number of Bitcoins that are going to exist over time. Down here, these markings are done in the number of blocks, but every tick is basically about 4 years. So if you follow it over, by the time we get into the 2030s, pretty much all Bitcoins that are ever going to exist will have been mined by that point. And how this happens is every 4 years, the block reward that's given to miners is cut in half. So the network is automatically made to rely more on transaction fees and new Bitcoins. And there's fewer and fewer new Bitcoins coming into existence that'll hit an equilibrium, and the maximum number of Bitcoins that will ever exist will pop out there and unlock the function. Next slide, please. So, what got me really excited about this when I first found out about it is the true potential for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to disrupt traditional financial markets. And we've already seen to a large degree this happening. One way in which it happened is that if you're familiar at all with the situation of people in certain states like Venezuela and Argentina, in many cases they've seen double-digit or triple-digit inflation, even larger in Venezuela for certain time periods. And moreover, it's illegal to trade your native Venezuelan bolivars for dollars or euros or any currency that would be resistant to inflation in comparison. So what many people have done is mine Bitcoin, which is also illegal, or use Bitcoin miners to mine their own Bitcoin, which is also illegal. And there have been several cases of Venezuelan miners being arrested for just trying to escape the fiat currency that they're trapped into. Another benefit in the way in which Bitcoin is disrupted is it allows people who can't get on the traditional banking system, which worldwide is a huge proportion of people, and even domestically is a fairly significant percentage. It allows these people to still be able to transact financially on a global scale. And it's very hard if you try to do that for cryptocurrencies through traditional banking. One example of this was in 2010. If you remember back then, the banking systems came together to basically put a blockade on WikiLeaks. Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, all these systems stopped any incoming donations to WikiLeaks. And so the way they circumvented this was by starting to accept Bitcoin donations, which they held on to for years, and now they're extremely rich. And another way, which is also encouraged in some other cryptocurrencies, is the idea of smart contracts. Basically, you can write in code into the blockchain, which automatically executes a contract based on certain criteria. And we're still just on the cusp of this. But over the next few years or decades, we're going to start really seeing the potential of how that can revolutionize the economy. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'm talking a little bit about practicality for end users. If you want to try to use Bitcoin, the first thing you need to do is create a wallet. And what a wallet is basically a collection of Bitcoin addresses which you use to send and receive money. Very important point about Bitcoin here is that the addresses exist in an asymmetric fashion. This is in contrast to your bank, which if you ever used a check, you've given everybody you've ever given a check to the information you need to take money from your account. All they need is the routing number and your account number. The same 2 bits of information can be used to receive money to your account, but also to spend money from it. And this technological simplicity is what leads to a lot of bank fraud. That sort of thing's not possible with Bitcoin because you receive money with your Bitcoin address, but you have to use your private key to be able to spend it. One good analogy for this is thinking of it as a Dropbox. Bitcoin addresses are public, Anybody can drop money into your address at will, but nobody can get to it. They have to have the key to be able to actually access that money. Another way in which Bitcoin is more secure than the traditional financial system is that every transaction is signed with a digital signature. And that signature is created from your key. And to use another analogy with the traditional banking system, every time you sign a check, you sign your name the same way, right? So anybody who's ever received a copy of your signature has what they need to potentially forge a check from you. Digital signatures don't work the same way. The private key that you use to create a digital signature will create a unique signature for every transaction that you've ever sent. So they can't be counterfeited, they can't be duplicated. As long as you are in sole possession of that key, then you can be assured that nobody is going to steal your funds from you or commit fraud, because it's not possible. Next slide, please. So a little bit about security. There's been a lot of news items over the past few years about Bitcoins getting hacked, things like that. The caveat is that it's never actually the Bitcoin network getting hacked. It's always end users that are either tricked into revealing their private keys, or exchanges that are hacked and their private keys are stolen. It's always something like that. The Bitcoin network itself has always been secure and will, in all likelihood, continue to remain that way. But what's extremely important for end users to remember is that in escaping from the traditional banking system into Bitcoin, you're not only allowed the maximum amount of freedom that you could possibly have with any sort of money, being able to send it literally anywhere in the world within minutes, but you also have the responsibility to keep that safe. Because if your Bitcoins are stolen, there's no one to petition, there's no one to take to court. You might not even be able to find out who did it. So it's of paramount importance that you know before you get to Bitcoin how to keep those Bitcoins safe. As I mentioned before, every Bitcoin address has an associated key, which you have to be sure that you need. I was just talking earlier about a number of stories that have gone around in the past few years about people who mined Bitcoin back in the day or bought some, and then they left it on their hard drive. And years later, the hard drive crashes, or they remember that it's on there, but then the computer's been thrown out or gone into disuse or something, and you can't recover it. Once you lose your Bitcoin private keys, those funds will never be recovered. There's no way to get them back. So creating backups, permanent backups, multiple backups is essential to store any sort of value in it. And there have been a lot of innovations in this space in the past 2 years to help people keep their Bitcoin safe. When I first got into it, we didn't have these options. The best one is a hardware wallet. The two most popular options are Trezor and Ledger. These things are great because they store your private keys on a tiny little device you hook up to your computer. The great thing is, even if your computer is infected with a virus or malware which knows how to steal Bitcoins, you're still safe because your private keys always stay on your little hardware device and you never lose it. The next best option, which I recommend to most people, is a wallet app for your phone. And this is counterintuitive to some people, but it's actually safer than using it on a computer because your Android or Apple phone is more locked down in terms of security than your desktop PC probably is. And the last place that you would want to keep Bitcoins or any other cryptocurrency is on a web wallet or exchange. There's a vast number of places that have been hacked or have Bitcoin stolen over the years. Is testament to the fact that it's very risky. Next slide, please. So that was definitely a brief overview for anybody who's new. And I do recommend, if you're interested, going and checking out some of the resources that are available on the web. Make sure you use good ones. There's a lot of misinformation going around out there. If anybody's a coder in particular, software developer by trade, I recommend checking out the Mastering Bitcoin book. It's a great technical introduction to Bitcoin. ton more depth here. So without any further ado, can I answer any questions? Yes.
Those Bitcoins and the dumpster, the hard drives that crash, the thumb drives that somebody threw away in a race by accident. What happens to those? I mean, are they just in the ether? They're never going to ever be claimed. They're not going to be part of the 21 million coins. They'll never be spendable. So that would actually reduce the number of coins.
Yeah. So the question is, what happens to Bitcoins that are lost? And the answer is they'll never be spent again. Nobody will ever find those private keys. They disappear. They basically exit the money supply. It's already estimated that several hundred thousand, if not millions, of Bitcoins have been lost this way, especially because in the early days, Bitcoins were worth practically nothing. People didn't take a lot of care to secure them, to keep them when they migrated from one computer system to another. Yes.
What do you think about the recent run up and then drop in the price of Bitcoins? What do you think's happening with that?
So the question was what I think about the recent increase in price. I've been around Bitcoin for a while, since 2011 in fact, and this has happened multiple times. So at this point, it's no longer a shock or surprise to me. It seems to be just a facet of human psychology and the way we interact with each other socially. That Bitcoin gets a little bit of momentum going, and then suddenly everybody's talking about it. People are all buying the price up. There's a lot of hype going on, and then it hits a peak and it calms down for a bit. So there've been at least 5 or 6 other Bitcoin bubbles before this one, where it gets really hyped up and then the price kind of settles down after that. For people who are new to it, it can be both alarming or exhilarating, depending on where your position is. But in the long run, I don't think it has much of an effect on the development or the long-term price. Yes?
You said there's a maximum number of Bitcoins. What's the incentive of somebody to be mining or doing all the maximum?
So the question is, what's the incentive to mine if there's a maximum number of Bitcoins? Yeah. So you're right, there are a maximum of 21 million Bitcoins that will ever be created. But every time you send a transaction, you pay a fee. And that fee goes to the miners who are doing that transaction processing, the mining process. So even after all the Bitcoins that have ever come into existence have, miners will still be doing that work in order to earn the transaction fee. Yeah. So the question is, even though there are a maximum number of Bitcoins, there's no limit to the amount of inflation through altcoins. And that is definitely true to an extent. As soon as Bitcoin was released, since it's open source, a lot of people sought to copy it, and some of these copycats have introduced interesting and revolutionary things into their new cryptocurrencies, and others have not. But it does dilute the entire market as a whole, because a lot of value then flows into buying alternative cryptocurrencies instead of Bitcoin. Yes?
Given that basically your own set of fees, is there any, is that the safety if, say, the government wants to confiscate your money if you were using it for illicit purposes? What security just they'll say, oh, well, this guy has it, but he's locked up now, so you can't access it.
Could you repeat that, please?
Sure. So normally under normal procedure of assets, if you're getting fined your account, right? Is that same thing under Bitcoin, or is it just they maintain touch because you're protected?
Okay, so the question is.
I'm not saying I've done this, but
He does what he does.
because that was your
worried. I'm asking for a friend. I'm asking for a friend.
So the question is, how does the government approach seizure of Bitcoin that's involved in criminal activity? And the answer is, if they can get to the private keys, they will. But there are cases in which they couldn't, and in that case, there's no seizure to be made. Yes.
The broader question, I mean, we're a government trying to regulate, or the tentative names for regulations, must be regulation and tax. If they use that, you know, that, where are they going with that?
So the question is, what's the government's approach in the future as far as regulation and taxing? That's really hard to say. As far as the United States, their approach is basically they're treating Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies as property. So where you sell it, you're supposed to pay capital gains tax or income tax on it. And as far as regulation, they're trying to tackle it the same way that they do any sort of other money transmission services, which is that certain reports have to be given to the IRS and defense, and when you transact with certain amounts, there's cash. Yes.
So practically, what is the process to convert money to Bitcoin? Spend.
So the question is how to convert money to Bitcoin if you want to get some. There are a number of online exchanges that you can use, places where you can basically use your existing bank to interface with the exchanges that are available to send in dollars or whatever currency you want to buy Bitcoin. So that's one way. The other way is decentralized exchanges where you can be able to meet one person and do a quick exchange. Yes.
How much our currencies are convertible? What's the state of the ability of a Bitcoin owner to go to a random currency transact?
Of being able to, as far as the major online trading markets, all the and Australian dollar, Canadian dollar, all that sorts of stuff. So all the major ones are easily found online. As far as smaller currencies, most of the transactions there are probably done on the decentralized exchanges that I just talked about, where if you go in and sign up, if you can find somebody to sell Bitcoin to you or buy Bitcoin from you in the local currency, then you can do it. And that's in every country in the world, as far as I know.
So about that line, and I wanted to buy something from India, and they wanted to use India, and that product is valuable. And I've got a Bitcoin wall. The other guy on the other end doesn't have
So the question is, what would you do if you wanted to buy something from a vendor that doesn't really want to deal with Bitcoin? There are services that have existed for several years now where they basically allow vendors to accept Bitcoin, and it'll be immediately converted into whatever their local currency is, so they don't ever have to actually touch it. And the going rate for this service is about 1%, which is even less than credit card fees. So that's a pretty good sell for vendors, at least in larger cases. Yes.
What do you think about saying separate they're trying to put
Okay, so it's slightly more technically oriented questions. So the question is basically about segregated witness, which is a new addition to Bitcoin's technology. To really explain this, I got to cover the scalability part of Bitcoin, which is that the downside of having a fully decentralized system in which every node on the network is processing and verifying every single transaction is that this is hard to scale to the level of a centralized service like Visa or MasterCard or a large bank like that. So for years, the rate at which Bitcoin transactions can be sent has been capped, and as a result, transaction fees have gone up. There are efforts in the works to create basically a second layer payment network on Lightning, which will alleviate a lot of the fee pressure and make Bitcoin scale to a much larger degree than it ever has before. Understandably, there are some people who have been very frustrated with the fees as they are now, as they have been in the past few months. And so at some point last year, they decided to split off and form another cryptocurrency, which is known as Bitcoin Cash. And what it basically did was it raised the limit on the transactions that you go through. My thought on that is that segregated limits, which is, it was basically a precursor to Lightning, and it was also an increase in the transaction cap. I'm very excited to see where that's going to go in the next year or two, because it's already being tested not only on the Bitcoin test network, but also on the Bitcoin main network. And this is a technological development that's been in the works in the past 2 years, and it's probably the largest one that Bitcoin has faced, and it's going to be solving its largest problem, scalability. So I'm very yes.
So related to that is that the fees on, for example, Ethereum or Ether are lower. So have they solved that problem already? And what's the relationship between Bitcoin and Ether?
Yes, the question is, if the fees on Ether are lower, have they solved that problem? The answer is no. So Ethereum has smaller fees because there's less of a limit. It works differently than Bitcoin. And because it's not quite as popular as Bitcoin, there's just fewer transactions going on in Ethereum, so naturally the fees will be lower. But eventually every cryptocurrency is going to face the same problem if they get as popular as Bitcoin is, where they have to solve the problem of scaling to a much larger size. And since Bitcoin is tackling that first with Lightning Network, if it works out, that's probably going to be adopted to all the other major cryptocurrencies, I would imagine. Although it's going to be complex to integrate it into Ether. Yes?
I think it used to be that most Bitcoin exchanges for stuff was either for computers or weed. So, I mean, is it to the point where we can go, where can you buy stuff other than Bitcoin, other, poker, weed, cocaine?
Online.
Libertarian
what
jumble
do
up there.
like, I understand maybe there's some place in Asia, like the electric companies take. When is CPNL going to take my Bitcoin?
So the question is, when can you spend Bitcoin on things that are not related to computers or drugs? And there have actually been a lot of companies over the past few years that have started accepting Bitcoin. I can say for every vacation I've taken in the past 4 years, I've paid for my hotel stay in Bitcoin, because Expedia started taking it a while back. It is a very techy level innovation, so it's natural that places like Dell and Newegg and Overstock would start taking Bitcoin first. I would say one of the things that's holding us back is regulation in this country, because it's fairly trivially and easy to set up a service where you accept payments incoming from consumers and then just forward it to a vendor, and the vendor never has to touch Bitcoin. So the consumer gets to pay in Bitcoin, and everybody gets what they want. The problem with that, as far as U.S. regulations, is that that service is now considered money transmitter, and that involves getting licenses in all 50 states, and it involves doing a large amount of federal reporting. So a lot of those services have popped up and then kind of died off as they realized the regulatory burden that they were facing.
Just in answer to his question, this is well, it's not a Bitcoin, it's a Bitcoin credit card. But I'm sure you're going to laugh at this, because I was on your list of the worst options in terms of this. I used this to buy a latte at Starbucks about a year and a half ago.
If you would have kept that Bitcoin, it would be
I
like
probably paid about $100 for that latte.
Brad, when are we going to take
exist.
Bitcoin as contributions to the Wake County Libertarian Party?
Yeah, we should.
We're going to need to start doing that.
Bitcoin credit card. I should clarify that when I put that list up, I was thinking more about storage. if you're going to be spending small amounts here and there, then it's fine to keep a hot wallet with nothing more than you're willing to lose. But you don't want to go buy a large amount of Bitcoin and then store it on something like that.
Well, I actually have a question. I actually have a question for Bruce, and my question is: when you paid for your lock key, what was the transaction fee?
They had no idea. Well, I don't. Okay. I could go back and look to see how much it actually was.
Well, if a transaction fee is $7,
but I didn't see the transaction fee, so I don't know if it was hidden from me or what. When I spent it, it appeared as a 0.0001 Bitcoin, which at the time I converted it, and it seemed reasonable. Right? And I've used it for like restaurants and things, very rarely. But I didn't see the transaction fee, so I don't know why that was.
The question is, what kind of transaction fee do you see in a Bitcoin-based credit card? And most likely there is none because all the transaction is all hidden behind the scenes as far as whoever issued the card. When you go to spend money, they deduct Bitcoin from your account. They don't actually have to ever send Bitcoin because they're sending dollars to whoever's receiving payment from you. So what's probably happening is there's a back end with an exchange where they're automatically balancing their account, and that allows them to send dollars.
So they'll batch a bunch of transactions and then take out Bitcoin in one lump sum or something, so they only pay one transaction fee.
Yeah. So your Bitcoins are not stored in a place where you can easily access them and send them to another Bitcoin account somewhere. They're stored by a third party which has that Bitcoin for you, and then is paying other services for you. So they don't have to send transactions every time you make a purchase there. Yes. So the question is, what are some other good altcoins to invest in? And I gotta give a caveat on this one, just because there's been so much hype in the market recently that, and there's so many altcoins that have popped up in the last couple of years, that most of them are probably eventually going to die off, and a lot of them try to bring something interesting and new to the system, but ultimately fail, or are just not revolutionary enough, or not well developed. And a lot of these things are spending way more money on marketing than they are on actual development. So as far as alternative currencies to Bitcoin that actually bring something new and interesting to the table, I do really like Ethereum because it focuses on smart contracts. It's really distributed computing system, which relies on the Ether, the tokens, to pay for distributed computing. I also like the privacy coins because Bitcoin as it is not anonymous. People say that a lot, but it's a myth. It's not really anonymous because you can see every transaction that's ever gone on in Bitcoin, where it's gone to and where it's from. And if you've ever associated your identity with a Bitcoin address, then people will be able to trace you through that. So coins that are attacked on the privacy side of it, like Monero or Zcash, I also find very interesting.
Was Monero? Litecoin going to merge with one of the coins? Is that something that may happen as some of these coins start merging?
So the question is whether some coins are merging, and to my knowledge, no. There's all kinds of crazy stuff going on. There's supposed to be a fork coming up between Bitcoin and Zcash that will credit holders on both networks, but create some new coin called Bitcoin Privacy List. Yeah, I don't even want to get into that. Yes.
Do you believe that they will eventually have to be marked down in cryptocurrency? Do you believe that it's fine that they can coexist?
So the question is, do I think there'll be one cryptocurrency or multiple ones exist? Going back to Hayek's idea of denationalization of money and having private competing currencies, I think that there's plenty of space for them to compete in the market. I do think that ones that excel at certain utility, such as being a currency, will tend to dominate. This is why, for example, there's a lot of there's a difference between Bitcoin and Ethereum, for example. Ethereum is not intended to be a currency so much as it is a distributed network where people write code, write contracts, and then have it distributed over the network and executed. So it's really a different use case than Bitcoin. And I think as far as cryptocurrencies can come up with different use cases that are not just being a currency, and they have a lot of potential. But even outside of that, I think there's more competition. Yes. Sorry, what was the name of that? I don't know.
Yeah, it's fairly new. It just came out in October last year. And what they're actually looking at is the credit card, which is where they can actually verify transactions. Let's say someone loan money from Joe to John, and John actually wants to say, well, I'm loaning you this. I want to see how much can I get back in a period of time. So they actually verify the transaction. Do you think that
so the question is about a particular new cryptocurrency, and honestly, since I'm not familiar with it, I can't say. What I will say is be skeptical and do a lot of your own due diligence, because a lot of these things have come and gone in the past. And unless you have a solid team that has not only a great idea, but also the ability to execute that idea, then they'll eventually fall by the wayside. Yes.
One criticism of Bitcoin that I've read, and I don't know if this applies to cryptocurrency in general, is that because of the nature of the way that the information is stored, as time goes on, each transaction becomes more and more complex to resolve because of the you track everything, and so everything becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. The records become bigger and bigger and bigger. And I read somewhere also that the amount of energy spent in the world on Bitcoin processing has been increasing logarithmically, and now it's more than the amount of energy Germany spends in a year. And presumably that would keep increasing also if the complexity increases. So how is this, what's your comment on that? Is that a valid criticism?
Okay, so the first question was about transaction processing. How does that continue as the blockchain?
It does seem like it takes longer to do transactions now than it used to.
So for nodes that are on the network, that have been active on the network, they don't really care, because on the margins, transactions are still coming in at the same rate, as long as the block size remains what it is now. For new nodes that are booting up on the network, then the larger the blockchain is to begin with, then the longer it's going to take them to catch up to the current state. So if you're going to go boot up a Bitcoin node right now, and try to get it to catch up, it's probably going to take a week plus or minus, given on how much computing power you have. So yes, over time that definitely grows, but there's certainly reason to believe that as computing power also tends to increase, that's not going to be a big deal. And the limits that currently exist on Bitcoin, it's still within reach. And the second question is regards to energy usage. And it is true that Bitcoin network consumes a massive amount of energy right now in order to do mining. The response to that is that it tends to conglomerate now in places where energy is very cheap. And so what we've ended up with is massive mining farms, just warehouses full of computer hardware, in places like Iceland, where there's very cheap geothermal energy, or in the Pacific Northwest, where there's very cheap hydro energy, I believe. There's actually a mining farm starting up in Canada somewhere, if I remember correctly. There's using a hydroelectric dam just to power warehouse for Bitcoin miners. Over time, I think this will even out as well. We're still in the craze of Bitcoin because new coins are still being minted at a fairly quick rate. Once that starts to taper off, miners are depending on transaction fees. We'll also see the energy usage start to taper off. I don't want it to decrease dramatically, because the mining power on the network is also what keeps Bitcoin secure. But there's certainly reason to believe that it's not going to continue to increase as insanely as it has in the past year.
All right. Fantastic.
Personally, and answer your question. So first, thank you for coming out. That was fantastic. Very, very educational. You apparently read a lot, which means you probably drink coffee as you sit in front of your computer screen. And not that you want to tag yourself, put that on your car, and definitely have a couple beers and a burger on us. We appreciate you coming out. Fantastic. Thank you. Only because we have quite a few people here who are probably first-time visitors. If you don't know, this is the Wake County Libertarian Party. And we have a number of candidates in Wake County that will be running for North Carolina House, North Carolina Senate, Court of Appeals at the state level. We're very active at this point. So if you are somebody who came out to hear about Bitcoin, but if you're also interested in freedom, a little less government, I encourage you to follow us because we're going to have active candidates in 2018. Your ballot is going to have a lot more choices than just R&D this coming year, at least at the state level. So thank you for coming out. And we may have a couple going for U.S. Congress as well, maybe 2 in the state. So we'll see. But it's going to be good. I mean, we're active now, so I appreciate your time.
Somebody asked a stupid question.